The Hebrew Bible, Volume 1, The Five Books of Moses. Introduction to the Hebrew Bible. 1. The Bible in English and the heresy of explanation. Why, after so many English versions, a new translation of the Hebrew Bible? There is, as I shall explain in detail, something seriously wrong with all the familiar English translations, traditional and recent, of the Hebrew Bible. Broadly speaking, one may say that in the case of the modern versions, the problem is a shaky sense of English, and in the case of the King James Version, a shaky sense of Hebrew. The present translation is an experiment in re-presenting the Bible, and above all, biblical narrative prose, in a language that conveys with some precision the semantic nuances and the lively orchestration of literary effects of the Hebrew, and at the same time has stylistic and rhythmic integrity as literary English. I shall presently give a more specific account of the kind of English I have aimed for and of the features of the Hebrew that have prompted my choices. But I think it will be helpful for me to say something first about why English translations of the Bible have been problematic, more problematic perhaps than most readers may realize. It is an old and in some ways unfair cliche to say that translation is always a betrayal, but modern English versions of the Bible provide unfortunately persuasive evidence for that uncompromising generalization. At first thought, it is rather puzzling that this should be the case. In purely quantitative terms, we live in a great age of Bible translation. Several integral translations of the Bible have been done since the middle of the 20th century, and a spate of English versions of individual biblical books have appeared. This period, moreover, is one in which our understanding of ancient Hebrew has become considerably more nuanced and precise than it once was, thanks to comparative Semitic philology, aided by archaeology, and also thanks to the careful reanalysis of the formal structures, syntax, grammar, morphology, verb tenses of biblical Hebrew. One might have expected that this recent flurry of translation activity, informed by the newly focused awareness of the meanings of biblical Hebrew, would have produced at least some English versions that would be both vividly precise and closer to the feel of the original than any of the older translations. Instead, the modern English versions, especially in their treatment of Hebrew narrative prose, have placed readers at a grotesque distance from the distinctive literary experience of the Bible in its original language. As a consequence, the King James Version, as Gerald Hammond, an eminent British authority on Bible translations, has convincingly argued, remains the closest approach for English readers to the original, despite its frequent and at times embarrassing inaccuracies, despite its archaisms, and despite its insistent substitution of Renaissance English tonalities and rhythms for biblical ones. Some observers have sought to explain the inadequacy of modern Bible translations in terms of the general decline of the English language. It is certainly true that there are far fewer people these days with a cultivated sensitivity to the expressive resources of the language, the nuances of lexical values, the force of metaphor and rhythm. And one is certainly much less likely to find such people on a committee of ecclesiastical or scholarly experts than one would have in the first decade of the 17th century. There are, nevertheless, still some brilliant stylists among English prose writers, and if our age has been graced with remarkable translations of Homer, Sophocles, and Dante, why not of the Bible? Part of the explanation, I suspect, is in the conjunction of philological scholarship and translation. I intend no churlish disrespect to philology. On the contrary, without it, our reading of the Bible, or indeed of any older text is no better than walking through a great museum on a very gloomy day with all the lights turned out. To read the Bible over the shoulder of a great philological critic like Abraham ibn Ezra, 1092, 1167, one of the earliest and still eminently worth studying, is to see many important things in fine focus for the first time. There is, however, a crucial difference between philology as a tool for understanding literary texts and philology as an end in itself. For literature and philology work with extremely different conceptions of what constitutes knowledge. To be fair to the broad enterprise of philology, which has included some great literary critics, I use the term here as shorthand for biblical philology, a discipline that, especially in its Anglo-American applications, has often come down to lexicography and the analysis of grammar. For the philologist, the great goal is the achievement of clarity. It is scarcely necessary to say that in all sorts of important but also delimited ways, clarity is indispensable in a translator's wrestling with the original text. The simplest case, but a pervasive one, consists of getting a handle on the meaning of particular terms. It is truly helpful, for example, to know that biblical nahal most commonly indicates not any sort of brook, creek, or stream, but a kind of freshet called a wadi in both Arabic and modern Hebrew that floods a dry desert gulch during the rainy months and vanishes in the heat of the summer. Suddenly, Job's "my brother is betrayed like a nahal" becomes a striking poetic image, where before it might have been a minor puzzlement. But philological clarity in literary texts can quickly turn into too much of a good thing. Literature in general, and the narrative prose of the Hebrew Bible in particular, cultivates certain profound and haunting enigmas, delights in leaving its audiences guessing about motives and connections, and above all, loves to set ambiguities of word choice and image against one another in an endless interplay that resists neat resolution. In polar contrast, the impulse of the philologist is, here a barbarous term nicely catches the tenor of the activity, to disambiguate the terms of the text. The general result when applied to translation is to reduce, simplify, and denature the Bible. These unfortunate consequences are all the more pronounced when the philologist, however acutely trained in that discipline, has an underdeveloped sense of literary diction, rhythm, and the uses of figurative language. And that, alas, is often the case in an era in which literary culture is not widely disseminated even among the technically educated. The unacknowledged heresy underlying most modern English versions of the Bible is the use of translation as a vehicle for explaining the Bible instead of representing it in another language. And in the most egregious instances, this amounts to explaining away the Bible. This impulse may be attributed not only to a rather reduced sense of the philological enterprise, but also to a feeling that the Bible, because of its canonical status, has to be made accessible, indeed transparent, to all. The one signal exception to all these generalizations is Everett Fox's 1995 American version of the Torah, emulating the model of the German translation by Martin Buber and Franz Rosenwig, begun in 1925, completed in 1961, which flaunts Hebrew etymologies, preserves nearly all repetitions of Hebrew terms, and invents German words. Fox goes the opposite extreme of other modern versions. His English has the great virtue of reminding us verse after verse of the strangeness of the Hebrew original, but it does so at the cost of often being not quite English, and consequently of becoming a text for study rather than a fluently readable version that conveys the stylistic poise and power of the Hebrew. Modern translators, in their zeal to uncover the meanings of the biblical text for the instruction of a modern readership, frequently lose sight of how the text intimates its meanings, the distinctive, artfully deployed features of ancient Hebrew prose and poetry that are the instruments for the articulation of all meaning, message, insight, and vision. One of the most salient characteristics of biblical Hebrew is its extraordinary concreteness, manifested especially in a fondness for images rooted in the human body. The general predisposition of modern translators is to convert most of this concrete language into more abstract terms that have the purported advantage of clarity, but turn the pungency of the original into stale paraphrase. A good deal of this concrete biblical language based on the body is what a linguist would call lexicalized metaphor, imagery here taken from body parts and bodily functions that is made to stand for some general concept as a fixed item in the vocabulary of the language. As I in English can be used to mean perceptiveness or a connoisseur's understanding. Dead metaphors, however, are the one persuasive instance of the resurrection of the dead, for at least the ghosts of the old concrete meanings float over the supposedly abstract acceptations of the terms, and this is something the philologically driven translators do not appear to understand. Many modern versions, Gerald Hammond tartly observes, eschew anything which smacks of imagery or metaphor, based on the curious assumption, I guess, that modern English is an image-free language. The price paid for this avoidance of the metaphorical will become evident by considering two characteristic and recurrent Hebrew terms and the role they play in representing the world in the biblical story. The Hebrew noun zera, the symbol represents the Hebrew consonant ayin, a glottal stop that might sound something like the Cockney pronunciation of the middle consonant of bottle, in which the dentalized t is replaced by a gulping sound produced from the larynx. Has the general meaning of seed, which can be applied either in the agricultural sense or to human beings as the term for semen. By metaphorical extension, semen becomes the established designation for what it produces, progeny. Modern translators, evidently unwilling to trust the ability of adult readers to understand that seed, as regularly in the King James Version may mean progeny, repeatedly render it as offspring, descendants, heirs, progeny, posterity. But I think there is convincing evidence in the texts themselves that the biblical writers never entirely forgot that their term for offspring also meant semen and had a precise equivalent in the vegetable world. To cite a distinctly physical example, when Anan knew what the seed, rather, Anan, quote, knew that the seed would not be his, that is, the progeny of his brother's widow, should he impregnate her, quote, he would waste his seed on the ground, so to give no seed to his brother. Genesis 38:9. Modern translators, despite their discomfort with body terms, can scarcely avoid the wasted seed here, because without it, the representation of spilling semen on the ground in coitus interruptus becomes unintelligible. E.A. Spicer substitutes offspring for seed at the end of the verse, however, and the Revised English Bible goes him one better by putting offspring at the beginning as well. Onan knew that the offspring would not count as his. And introducing seed in the middle as object of the verb to spill, and scuttling back to the decorousness of offspring at the end, a prime instance of explanation under the guise of translation. But the biblical writer is referring to seed as much at the end of the verse as at the beginning. Onan adopts the stratagem of coitus interruptus in order not to give seed, that is, semen, to Tamar, and as a necessary consequence of this contraceptive act, he avoids providing her with offspring. The thematic point of this moment, anchored in sexual practice, law, and human interaction, is blunted by not preserving seed throughout. Even in contexts not directly related to sexuality, the concreteness of this term often amplifies the meaning of the utterance. When, for example, at the end of the story of the binding of Isaac, God reiterates his promise to Abraham, the multiplication of seed is strongly linked with cosmic imagery, harking back to the creation story of heaven and earth. I will greatly bless you and will greatly multiply your seed as the stars in the heavens and as the sand on the shore of the sea. Genesis 22:17. If seed here is rendered as offspring or descendants, what we get are two essentially mathematical similes of numerical increase. That is, in fact, the primary burden of the language God addresses to Abraham. But as figurative language, it also imposes itself visually on the retina of the imagination. And so, underlying the idea of a single late-born son whose progeny will be countless millions is an image of human seed, perhaps reinforced by the shared white color of semen and stars scattered across the vast expanses of the starry skies and through the innumerable particles of sand on the shore of the sea. To substitute offspring for seed here may not fundamentally alter the meaning, but it diminishes the vividness of the statement, making it just a little harder for readers to sense why these ancient texts have been so compelling down through the ages. The most metaphorically extended body part in biblical Hebrew is the hand, though head and foot are also abundantly represented in figurative senses. Now, it is obvious enough, given the equivalent usages in modern Western languages, that hand can be employed figuratively to express such notions as power, control, responsibility, and trust, to which biblical Hebrew adds one meaning peculiar to itself: commemorative monument. But most modern translators substitute one or another of these abstract terms, introducing supposed clarity where things were perfectly clear to begin with, and subverting the literary integrity of the story. In the two sequential episodes that end with Joseph's being cast into a pit, the first is a dry cistern, the second an Egyptian prison, but the two are explicitly linked by the use of the term bor for both. The recurrently invoked hand is a focusing device that both defines and complicates the moral themes of the story. Reuben, hearing his brother's murderous intentions, seeks to rescue Joseph from their hands. He implores his brothers, "Lay not a hand upon him," just as in the other strand of the story, Judah says, "Let not our hand be against him." E. A. Spicer, faithful to the clarifying impulse of the modern Bible scholar's philological imagination, renders both these phrases as "do away with," explaining that it would be illogical to have Reuben or Judah say, "Don't lay a hand on him," since in fact the counsel proffered involves seizing him, stripping him, and throwing him into the pit. But in fact, this alleged illogic is the luminous logic of the writer's moral critique. Reuben pleads with his brothers not to lay a hand on Joseph, that is, not to shed his blood. This is the phrase he uses at the beginning of his speech, but neither his plea nor Judah's proposal is an entirely innocent one. Although each urges the brothers lay no hand on Joseph, there is a violent laying on of hands necessitated by the course of action each proposes. Even more pointedly, once Joseph is headed south with the caravan, those same fraternal hands will take his ornamented tunic, the King James Version's coat of many colors, slaughter a kid, dip the garment in the blood, and send it off to Jacob. The image of hands holding a garment belonging to Joseph that is turned into false evidence brilliantly returns at the climactic moment of the next episode involving him in Genesis 39. When Joseph flees from the lust of his master's wife, he left his garment in her hand, because she has virtually torn it off his back in trying to effect her reiterated "lie with me" by seizing him. In her accusation of Joseph, she alters the narrator's twice stated "in her hand" to "by me," implying that he disrobed deliberately before attempting to rape her. But the narrator's cunning deployment of repeated terms has conditioned us to zero in on these two pivotal words: Vaya azov beyad. He left in the hand of. For in the 6 initial framing verses of the story, hand appears 4 times, with the last, most significant occurrence being this summary of the comprehensiveness of Joseph's stewardship. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hands. 39:6. Hebrew idiom allows the writer to use hand in the singular, thus creating an exact phrasal identity between the figurative reference to the hand in which the trust of stewardship is left, and the literal reference to the hand in which the garment belonging to the object of sexual desire is left. The invocation of hand in chapters 37 and 39, the story of Judah and Tamar lies between them, forms an elegant ABAB pattern. In chapter 37, hands are laid on Joseph, an action carried forward in the resumptive repetition at the very beginning of chapter 39, when he is bought from the hands of the Ishmaelites. When we have the supremely competent hand, or hands of Joseph, into which everything is placed or left, and by which everything succeeds, then again a violent hand is laid on Joseph, involving the stripping of his garment, as in the episode with the brothers. At the end of the chapter, Joseph, in prison again, has everything entrusted to his dependable hands, with this key term twice stated in the 3.5 verses of the closing frame. A kind of dialectic is created in the thematic unfolding of the story between hand as the agency of violent impulse and hand as the instrument of scrupulous management. Although the concrete term is probably used with more formal precision in this particular sequence than is usually the case elsewhere, the hands of Joseph and the hands upon Joseph provide a fine object lesson about how biblical narrative is misrepresented when translators tamper with the purposeful and insistent physicality of its language, as here when hand is transmuted into trust or care. Such substitutions offer explanations or interpretations instead of translations, and thus betray the original. There are, alas, more pervasive ways than the choice of terms in which nearly all the modern English versions commit the heresy of explanation. The most global of these is the prevalent modern strategy of repackaging biblical syntax for an audience whose reading experience is assumed to be limited to Time, Newsweek, the New York Times, or the Times of London and the internet. Now, it is often asserted with seemingly self-evident justice that the fundamental difference between biblical syntax and modern English syntax is between a system in which parallel clauses linked by and predominate, what linguists call parataxis, and one in which the use of subordinate clauses and complex sentences predominates, what linguists call hypotaxis. Modern English has a broad array of modal and temporal discriminations in its system of verbs and a whole armament of subordinate conjunctions to stipulate different relationships among clauses. Biblical Hebrew, on the other hand, has only two aspects. Instead of a clear-cut expression of the temporal frame in which actions occur, past, present, future, past, perfect, and so forth, aspects indicate chiefly whether the action has been completed or is to be completed. They are probably not tenses in our sense of verbs, together with one indication of a jussive mode, when a verb is used to express a desire or exhortation to perform the action in question, and a modest number of subordinate conjunctions. Although there are certainly instances of significant syntactic subordination, the characteristic biblical syntax is additive, working with parallel clauses linked by and, which in the Hebrew is not even a separate word, but rather a particle, wa, means hook. The modern Hebrew pronunciation is vav, with the vowel sounding like short a, and a French word like vav, with which it would rhyme. It means hook, and that is prefixed to the first word of the clause. The assumption of most modern translators has been that this sort of syntax will be either unintelligible or at least alienating to modern readers, and so should be entirely rearranged as modern English. There are two basic problems with this procedure. First, it ignores the fact that parataxis is the essential literary vehicle of biblical narrative. It is the way the ancient Hebrew writers saw the world, linked events in it, artfully ordered it, and narrated it. And one gets a very different world if their syntax is jettisoned. Second, rejection of biblical parataxis presupposes a very simplistic notion of what constitutes modern literary English. The implicit model seems to be, as I have suggested, the popular press, as well as perhaps high school textbooks, bureaucratic directives, and ordinary conversation. But serious writers almost never accept such a leveling limitation to a bland norm of popular usage. If one thinks of the great English stylists among 20th century novelists, writers like Joyce, Nabokov, Faulkner, and Virginia Woolf, there is not one among them whose use of language, including the deployment of syntax, even vaguely resembles the workaday simplicity and patently consistent orderliness that recent translators of the Bible have posited as the norm of modern English. It is also well to keep in mind that literary style, like many other aspects of literature, is constantly self recapitulative, invoking recollections of its near and distant literary antecedents, so that modernists like Joyce and Faulkner sometimes echo biblical language and cadences, and a mannered stylist like Hemingway, in making and his most prominent connective, surely has the King James Version of the Bible in mind. And in any event, the broad history of both Semitic and European languages and literatures evinces a strong differentiation in most periods between everyday language and the language of literature. The assumption of biblical philologists that parallel syntax is alien to modern literary English is belied by the persistent presence of highly wrought paratactic prose even at the end of the 20th century and beyond. A variety of self-conscious English stylists in the modern era, from Gertrude Stein to Cormac McCarthy, have exhibited a fondness for chains of parallel utterances linked by and, in which the basic sentence type is the same structurally as that used again and again in biblical prose. What such a style makes manifest in a narrative is a series of more or less discrete events or micro events in a chain, not unlike the biblical names of begetters and begotten that are strung one after another in the chains of the genealogical lists. The biblical writers generally chose not to order these events in ramified networks of causal, conceptual or temporal subordination, not because hypotaxis was an unavailable option, as the opening verses of the second creation story, Genesis 2, 4 through 5, clearly demonstrate. The continuing appeal, moreover, for writers in our own age of the syntax dominated by and, which highlights the discrete event, suggests that parallel syntax may still be a perfectly viable way to represent in English the studied parallelism of verbs and clauses of ancient Hebrew narrative. Since a literary style is composed of very small elements as well as larger structural features, an English translator must confront the pesky question of whether the ubiquitous Hebrew particle that means and should be represented at all in translation. This is obviously not a problem when the vav simply connects two nouns, as in the heavens and the earth. But what of its constant use at the beginning of sentences and clauses prefixed to verbs? The argument against translating it in these cases is that the primary function of the vav appended to a verb is not to signify and, but to indicate that the Hebrew prefix conjugation, which otherwise is used for actions yet to be completed, is reporting past events. Hence, its designation in the terminology of classical Hebrew grammar as the vav of conversion. It is far from clear, as modern Bible scholars tend to assume, that the fulfillment of one linguistic function by a particle of speech automatically excludes any others. On the contrary, it is entirely likely that for the ancient audience, the vav appended to the verb both converted its temporal aspect and continued to signify and. But semantics aside, the general practice of modern English translators suppressing the and when it is attached to a verb has the effect of changing the tempo, rhythm, and construction of events in biblical narrative. Let me illustrate by quoting a narrative sequence from Genesis 24, first in my own version, which reproduces every and every element of parataxis, and then in the version of the Revised English Bible. The Revised English Bible is, in general, one of the most compulsive repackagers of biblical language, though in this instance, the reordering of the Hebrew is relatively minor. Its rendering of these sentences is roughly interchangeable with any of the other modern versions. The Jerusalem Bible, the New Jewish Publication Society, Spicer, one might choose. I begin in the middle of verse 16, where Rebecca becomes the subject of a series of actions. And she came down to the spring and filled her jug and came back up. And the servant ran toward her and said, "Pray, let me sip a bit of water from your jug." And she said, "Drink, my lord." And she hurried and tipped down her jug on one hand and let him drink. And she let him drink his fill and said, "For your camels too, I shall draw water until they drink their fill." And she hurried and emptied her jug into the trough. And she ran again to the well to draw water and drew water for all his camels. And this is how the Revised English Bible, in keeping with the prevailing assumptions of most recent translations, renders these verses in what is presumed to be sensible modern English. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up again. Abraham's servant hurried to meet her and said, "Will you give me a little water from your jar?" "Please drink, sir," she answered, and at once lowered her jar in her hand to let him drink. When she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I shall draw water also for your camels until they have had enough." She quickly emptied her jar into the water trough, and then hurrying again to the well, she drew water and watered all the camels. There is, as one would expect, some modification of biblical parataxis, though it is not so extreme here as elsewhere in the Revised English Bible. "And she let him drink his fill" is converted into an introductory adverbial clause, "when she had finished giving him a drink." Actually, in consonance with the otherwise paratactic King James Version, "and she hurried" is compressed into quickly. "And she ran again" becomes the participial hurrying again. Moves of this sort, it should be said, push translation to the verge of paraphrase, recasting and interpreting the original instead of representing it. The most striking divergence between these two versions is that mine has 15 ands, corresponding precisely to 15 occurrences of the particle vav in Hebrew, whereas the Revised English Bible manages with just 5. What difference does this make? To begin with, it should be observed that the vav, whatever is claimed about its linguistic function, is by no means an inaudible element in the phonetics of the Hebrew text. We must keep constantly in mind that these narratives were composed to be heard, not merely to be decoded by a reader's eye. The reiterated "and" then plays an important role in creating the rhythm of the story, in phonetically punctuating the forward-driving movement of the prose. The elimination of the "and" in the Revised English Bible and in all its modern cousins produces, certainly to my ear, an abrupt, awkward effect in the sound pattern of the language, or to put it more strictly, a kind of narrative arrhythmia. More is at stake here than pleasing sounds, for the heroine of the repeated actions is, in fact, subtly but significantly reduced in all the rhythmically deficient versions. She, of course, performs roughly the same acts in the different versions, politely offering water to the stranger, lowering her jug so that he can drink, rapidly going back and forth to the spring to bring water for the camels. But in the compressions, syntactical reorderings, and stop and start movements of the modernizing version, the encounter at the well and Rebecca's actions are made to seem rather matter of fact, however exemplary her impulse of hospitality. This tends to obscure what the Hebrew highlights, which is that she's doing something quite extraordinary. Rebecca at the well presents one of the rare biblical instances of the performance of an act of Homeric heroism. The servant begins by asking modestly to sip a bit of water, as though all he wanted were to wet his lips. But we need to remember, as the ancient audience surely did, that a camel, after a long desert journey, can drink as much as 25 gallons of water. And there are 10 camels here, whom Rebecca offers to water until they drink their fill. The chain of verbs tightly linked by all the ands does an admirable job in conveying this sense of the young woman's hurling herself with prodigious speed into the sequence of required actions. Even her dialogue is scarcely a pause in the narrative momentum, but is integrated syntactically and rhythmically into the chain. And she said, "Drink, my lord." And she hurried and tipped down her jug. And she hurried and emptied her jug into the trough. And she ran again to the well to draw water and drew water for all his camels. The parallel syntax and the barrage of ands, far from being the reflex of a primitive language, are as artfully effective in furthering the ends of the narrative as any device one could find in a sophisticated modern novelist. Beyond these issues of syntax and local word choice lies a fundamental question that no modern translator I know of has really confronted. What level, or perhaps levels, of style is represented in Biblical Hebrew? There's no reason, I believe, to be awestruck by the sheer antiquity of the text. If Biblical Hebrew could be shown to reflect a pungent colloquial usage in the ancient setting, or free commingling of colloquial and formal language, it would be only logical to render it with equivalent levels of diction in modern English. As a matter of fact, all the modern translators, from Spicer to Fox to the sundry ecclesiastical committees in both America and England, have shown a deaf ear to diction, as though the only important considerations in rendering a literary text were lexical values and grammatical structures, while the English terms chosen could be promiscuously borrowed from boardroom or bedroom or scholar's word hoard with little regard to the tonality and connotation the words carried with them from their native linguistic habitat. Whatever conclusions we may draw about the stylistic level of Biblical Hebrew are a little precarious because we, of course, have no record of the ancient spoken language. And if, as seems likely, there were extra-canonical varieties or genres of Hebrew writing in the ancient world, the vestiges have long since crumbled into dust. Did, for example, the citizens of Judah in the time of Jeremiah speak in a parallel syntax using the Vav consecutive and employing roughly the same vocabulary that we find in his prophecies, or in Deuteronomy and Genesis? Although there is no proof, my guess is that vernacular syntax and grammar probably differed in some ways from their literary counterparts. In regard to vocabulary, there's evidence that what we see in the canonical books would not have been identical with everyday usage. First, there is the problem of the relative paucity of vocabulary in biblical literature. As a Spanish Hebrew scholar, Angel Sáenz Badillos has observed in his History of the Hebrew Language, 1993, the biblical lexicon is so restricted that it is hard to believe it could have served all the purposes of quotidian existence in a highly developed society. The instance of the poetry of Job, with its unusual number of words not found elsewhere in Scripture, is instructive in this regard. The Job poet, in his powerful impulse to forge a poetic imagery that would represent humankind, God, and nature in a new and even startling light, draws on highly specific language from manufacturing processes, food preparation, commercial and legal institutions, which would never be used in biblical narrative. The plausible conclusion is that the Hebrew of the Bible is a conventionally delimited language, roughly analogous in this respect to the French of the neoclassical theater. It was understood by writers and their audiences, at least in the case of narrative, that only certain words were appropriate for the literary rendering of events. There is evidence, moreover, that people in everyday life may have had different words for many of the basic concepts and entities that are mentioned in the Bible. This argument was persuasively made by the Israeli linguist Abba Ben David in his still indispensable 1967 study, available only in Hebrew, The Language of the Bible and the Language of the Sages. Ben David offers a fascinating explanation for one of the great mysteries of the Hebrew language: the emergence, toward the end of the pre-Christian era, of a new kind of Hebrew, which became the language of the early rabbis. Now, it is widely recognized that this new Hebrew reflected the influence of the Aramaic vernacular in morphology, in grammar, and in some of its vocabulary, and that, understandably, it also incorporated a vast number of Greek and Latin loanwords. But what is puzzling is that Rabbinic Hebrew also uses a good many indigenous Hebrew terms that are absent from the biblical corpus, or reflected only in rare and marginal biblical cognates. The standard terms in Rabbinical Hebrew for sun and moon, and some of its frequently used verbs like to look, to take, to enter, to clean, are entirely different from their biblical counterparts, without visible influence from any of the languages impinging on Hebrew. Where did these words come from? Ben David, observing, as have others before him, that there are incipient signs of an emergent rabbinic Hebrew in late biblical books like Jonah and the Song of Songs, makes the bold and, to my mind, convincing proposal that rabbinic Hebrew was built upon an ancient vernacular that for the most part had been excluded from the literary language used for the canonical texts. This makes particular sense if one keeps in mind that the early rabbis were anxious to draw a line between their own oral Torah and the written Torah they were expounding. For the purposes of legal and homiletic exegesis, they naturally would have used a vernacular Hebrew rather than the literary language, and when their discourse was first given written formulation in the Mishnah in the early 3rd century CE, that text would have recorded this vernacular, which probably had a long prehistory in the biblical period. It is distinctly possible that when a 9th century BCE Israelite farmer mopped his brow under the blazing sun, he did not point to it and say Shemesh, as it is invariably called in biblical prose texts, but rather Hama, as it is regularly designated in the Mishnah. There is, of course, no way of plotting a clear chronology of the evolution of rabbinic Hebrew from an older vernacular, no way of determining how far back into the biblical period various elements of rabbinic language may go. It is sufficient for our effort to gauge the level of style of the Bible's literary prose merely to grant the very high likelihood that the language of the canonical texts was not identical with the vernacular, that it reflected a specialized or elevated vocabulary, and perhaps even a distinct grammar and syntax. Let me cite a momentary exception to the rule of biblical usage that may give us a glimpse into this excluded vernacular background of a more formal literary language. It is well known that in biblical dialogue, all the characters speak proper literary Hebrew, with no intimations of slang, dialect, or idiolect. A single striking exception is impatient Esau's first speech to Jacob in Genesis 25. Let me gulp down some of this red stuff. Inarticulate with hunger, he cannot come up with the ordinary Hebrew term for stew. And so he makes do with ha'adom, hazeh, literally this red. But what is more interesting for our purpose is the verb Esau uses for feeding, hal-eteni. This is the sole occurrence of this verb in the biblical corpus, but in the Talmud it is a commonly used term with the specific meaning of stuffing food into the mouth of an animal. One cannot be certain this was its precise meaning in the biblical period because words do, after all, undergo semantic shifts in a period of considerably more than 1,000 years, but it seems safe to assume, minimally, that even a millennium before the rabbis, hal-it would have been a cruder term for feeding than the standard biblical ha'akil. What I think happened at this point in Genesis is that the author, in the writerly zest with which he sought to characterize Esau's crudeness, allowed himself, quite exceptionally, to introduce a vernacular term for coarse eating or animal feeding into the dialogue that would jibe nicely with his phrase, this red stuff. After the close of the biblical era, this otherwise excluded term would surface in the legal pronouncements of the rabbis on animal husbandry, together with a host of vernacular words used in the ancient period but never permitted to enter the canonical texts. All this strongly suggests that the language of biblical narrative in its own time was stylized, decorous, dignified, and readily identified by its audiences as a language of literature, in certain ways distinct from the language of quotidian reality. The tricky complication, however, is that in most respects, it also was not a lofty style, and was certainly neither ornate nor euphemistic. If some of its vocabulary may have reflected a specialized literary lexicon, the language of biblical narrative also makes abundant use of ordinary Hebrew words that must have been in everyone's mouth from day to day. Just to mention the few recurrent terms on which I have commented: hand, house, all, and seed are primary words in every phase of the history of Hebrew, and they continue to appear as such in the rabbinic language, where so much else is altered. Biblical prose, then, is a formal literary language, but also, paradoxically, a plain spoken one, and, moreover, a language that evinces a strong commitment to using a limited set of terms again and again, making an aesthetic virtue out of the repetition. It should be added that the language of the Bible reflects not one level of diction, but a certain range of dictions, as I shall explain presently. What is the implication of this analysis for an appropriate modern English equivalent to ancient Hebrew style? The right direction, I think, was hit on by the King James Version, following the great model of Tyndale a century before it. There's no good reason to render biblical Hebrew as contemporary English, either lexically or syntactically. This is not to suggest that the Bible should be represented as fussily old-fashioned English, but a limited degree of archaizing coloration is entirely appropriate, employed with other strategies for creating a language that is stylized yet simple and direct, free of the overtones of contemporary colloquial usage, but with a certain timeless, homespun quality. An adequate English version should be able to indicate the small but significant modulations in diction in the biblical language, something the stylistically uniform King James Version, however, entirely fails to do. A suitable English version should avoid at all costs the modern abomination of elegant synonymous variation, for the literary prose of the Bible turns everywhere on significant repetition, not variation. Similarly, the translation of terms on the basis of immediate context, except when it becomes grotesque to do otherwise, is to be resisted as another instance of the heresy of explanation. Finally, the mesmerizing effect of these ancient stories will scarcely be conveyed if they are not rendered in cadenced English prose that, at least in some ways, corresponds to the powerful cadences of the Hebrew. Let me now comment more particularly on the distinctive biblical treatment of diction, word choice, syntax, and rhythm, and what it implies for translation. The biblical prose writers favor what we may think of as a primary vocabulary. They revel in repetition, sometimes of a stately refrain-like sort, sometimes deployed in ingenious patterns through which different meanings of the same term are played against one another. Elegant synonymity is alien to biblical prose, and it is only rarely that a highly specialized term is used instead of the more general word. Here is a characteristic biblical way of putting things. And God made the two great lights, the great light for dominion of day, and the small light for dominion of night and the stars. Genesis 1:16. In addition to the poised emphasis of the internal repetitions in the sentence, one should note that the primary term for a source of light, ma'or, transparently cognate with or, the light that is divided from the darkness in 1:4, is placed in the foreground. In fact, there are half a dozen biblical synonyms for light, suggesting a range roughly equivalent to English terms like illumination, effulgence, brilliance, and splendor, but these are all reserved for the more elaborate vocabulary of poetry, whereas in prose, the writer sticks to the simplicity of or and ma'or, and everywhere it behooves a translator to do the same with English equivalents. Some biblical scholars might object that my example is skewed because it is taken from the so-called priestly source, which has a stylistic predilection for high decorousness and cadent repetitions, but the stylistic difference in this regard between P and the two other conjectured source documents of the Pentateuch, designated J and E, is one of degree, not kind. Thus, when the second version of the creation story, commonly identified as J's, begins in Genesis 2:4, we do get some greater degree of specification in the language, in keeping with the way creation is here imagined. Instead of the verbs to create, bara, and to make, asa, that accompany God speaking the world into being in chapter 1, we are given the potter's term to fashion, yatsar, and the architectural term to build, bana. These remain, however, within the limits of a primary vocabulary. The nuanced and specialized lexicon of manufacturing processes one encounters in the poetry of Job and of Deutero-Isaiah is firmly excluded from the stylistic horizon of this narrative prose, though the subject might have invited it. The translator's task, then, is to mirror the repetitions as much as is feasible. Let me cite one small example where I learned from my own mistake. When Joseph's brothers recount to Jacob what happened on their first trip to Egypt, they say, in the English of my first draft, "The man who is lord of the land spoke harshly to us and accused us of being spies in the land." Genesis 42:30. The verb accused is also used in the New Jewish Publication Society translation. On rereading, I realized that I had violated the cardinal principle not to translate according to context. The Hebrew says, very literally, gave us as spies. Give, in biblical usage, being one of those all-purpose verbs that variously means to set, to place, to grant, to deem. I hastened to change the last clause to made us out to be spies, because to make, with or without an accompanying preposition, is precisely such a primary term that serves many purposes, and so is very much in keeping with biblical stylistic practice. What is surprising about the biblical writer's use of this deliberately limited vocabulary is that it can be so precise and even nuanced. Our own cultural preconceptions of writers scrupulously devoted to finding exactly the right word are associated with figures like Flaubert and Joyce, who meticulously choose the terms of their narratives from a large repertory of finely discriminated lexical items. Biblical prose often exhibits an analogous precision within the severe limits of its primary vocabulary. There are, for example, two paired terms, masculine and feminine in biblical Hebrew, to designate young people, na'ar, na'ara, in this translation lad and young woman, and yaled, yalda, in this translation child and girl. The first pair is somewhat asymmetrical because na'ar often also means servant or anyone in a subaltern position, and sometimes means elite soldier, whereas na'ara usually refers to a nubile young woman and only occasionally to a servant girl. Though there are rare biblical occurrences of yaled in the sense of young man, it generally designates someone younger than na'ar. Etymologically, it means the one who is born, reflecting a development parallel to the French enfant. With this little to work with, it is remarkable how much the biblical writers accomplish in the deployment of the terms. In the first part of the story of the banishment of Hagar and Ishmael, Genesis 21, Ishmael is referred to consistently as the child, as was his infant half-brother Isaac at the beginning of this chapter. The grief-stricken mother in the wilderness says to herself, "Let me not see when the child dies." From the moment God speaks in the story, verse 17, Ishmael is invariably referred to as the lad, evidently with an intimation of tenderness, but also with the suggestion that he is a young man, Na'ar, who will go on to have a future. In the elaborately parallel episode in the next chapter that features Abraham and Isaac in the wilderness, Isaac is referred to by man and God as the lad, and the term is played off against the lads who are Abraham's servants accompanying him on his journey, and not his flesh and blood. And Abraham said to his lads, "Sit you here with the donkey, and let me and the lad walk ahead." In the story of the rape of Dinah, Genesis 34, she's first referred to as Leah's daughter, and not Jacob's daughter. For it is Leah's sons, Simeon and Levi, who will exact vengeance for her. The initial designation of daughter aligns her with both the daughters of the land, among whom she goes out to sea, and Shechem, Hamor's son. Son and daughter are cognates in Hebrew, who sees her, takes her, and rapes her. After the act of violation, Shechem is overcome with love for Dinah, and he implores his father, "Take me this girl, Yalda, as wife." Speaking to his father, then, he identifies tenderly the victim of his own lust as a girl child. When he parleys with Dinah's brothers, asking permission to marry her, he says, "Give me the young woman, Na'ara, as wife." Now using the term for a nubile woman that is strictly appropriate to betrothal negotiations. After the brothers stipulate their surgical precondition for the betrothal, the narrator reports, "And the lad, Na'ar, lost no time in doing the thing, for he wanted Jacob's daughter." Suddenly, as the catastrophe of this gruesome tale becomes imminent, we learn that the sexually impulsive man is only a lad, probably an adolescent like Dinah, a discovery that is bound to complicate our task of moral judgment. And now, Dinah is called Jacob's daughter, not Leah's, probably because that is how Shechem sees her, not realizing that the significant relationship is through her mother to her two full brothers who are plotting a terrible retribution for her violation. It should be clear from all this that a translation that respects the literary precision of the biblical story must strive to reproduce its nice discrimination of terms and cannot be free to translate a word here one way and there another for the sake of variety or for the sake of context. It must be admitted, however, that some compromises are inevitable because modern English clearly does not coincide semantically with ancient Hebrew in many respects. The stuff from which the first human is fashioned, for example, Adamah, manifestly means soil, and it continues to have that meaning, as it recurs at crucial junctures in the story of the garden and the primordial banishment. But alas, Adamah also means land, farmland, country, and even earth, and to translate it invariably as soil, for the sake of terminological consistency, as Everett Fox does, leads to local confusions and conspicuous peculiarities. To take a more extreme example, a term that has no semantic analog in English, the Hebrew nephesh, which the King James Version, following the Vulgate, often translates as soul, refers to the breath of life in the nostrils of a living creature and by extension, lifeblood, or simply life, and by another slide of association, person. It is also used as an intensifying form of the personal pronoun, having roughly the sense of very self. In the face of this bewildering diversity of meaning, one is compelled to abandon the admirable principle of lexical consistency and to translate regretfully according to immediate context. Finally, though, many recurring biblical terms have serviceable English equivalents like lad for na'ar. There are instances in which a translation must make another kind of compromise because, given the differences between modern and biblical culture, the social, moral, and ideological connotations of terms in the two languages do not adequately correspond. Consider the tricky case of terms for sexual intercourse. In English, these tend to be either clinical and technical, or rude, or bawdy, or euphemistic, and absolutely none of this is true of the verbs used for sex in the Bible. In Genesis, three different terms occur: to know, to lie with, and to come into. To know, with one striking antithetical exception, indicates sexual possession by a man of his legitimate spouse. Modern solutions such as to be intimate with, to cohabit with, to sleep with are all egregiously wrong in tone and implication. Fortunately, the King James Version has established a strong precedent in English by translating the verb literally. And carnal knowledge is part of our language, so it is feasible to reserve the literal Hebrew usage and translation. There is, I think, a good deal to be said for the general procedure of Tyndale and King James Version in imitating many Hebrew idioms and thus giving the English a certain Hebraic coloration. Lie with is a literal equivalent of the Hebrew, though in English it is vaguely euphemistic, whereas in Hebrew it is a more brutally direct or carnally explicit idiom for sexual intercourse, without, however, any suggestion of obscenity. The, the most intractable of the three expressions, to come into or to enter, the most intractable of the three expressions is to come into or to enter. In non sexual contexts, this is the ordinary biblical verb for entering or arriving, to enter or to come into. However, is a misleading translation because the term clearly refers not merely to sexual penetration, but to the whole act of sexual consummation. It is used with great precision, not registered by biblical scholarship, to indicate a man's having intercourse with a woman he has not yet had as a sexual partner, whether she is his wife, his concubine, or a whore. The underlying spatial imagery of the term, I think, is of the man's entering the woman's sphere for the first time through a series of concentric circles, her tent or chamber, her bed, her body. A translator then ought not surrender the image of coming into, but come into by itself doesn't quite do it. My own solution, in keeping with the slight strangeness of Hebraizing idioms of the translation as a whole, was to stretch an English idiom to cover the biblical usage. This translation consistently renders the Hebrew expression in question as come to bed with, an idiom that in accepted usage a woman could plausibly use to a man referring to herself, come to bed with me. But in my translation is extended to a woman's reference to another woman, come to bed with my slave girl, and to a reference in the third person by the narrator or a male character to sexual consummation. Give me my wife, Jacob says to Laban, and let me come to bed with her. Biblical syntax, beyond the basic pattern of parallel clauses, provides another occasion for what I have called a slight strangeness. The word order in biblical narrative is very often as finely expressive as the lexical choices. In many instances, the significant sequence of terms can be reproduced effortlessly and idiomatically in English, and it is a testament to the literary sensitivity of modern translators that they so often neglect to do so. Here, for example, is how the narrator reports Abimelech's discovery of the conjugal connection between Isaac and the woman Isaac had claimed was his sister. Abimelech looked out the window and saw, and there was Isaac playing with Rebekah, his wife. Genesis 26:8. The move into the character's point of view after the verbs of seeing is signaled by the so-called presentative vehine, like voici in French, which in this case I have represented by there, but usually render as look, following the King James Version behold, and so deliberately coining an English idiom because the biblical term is so crucial for indicating shifts in narrative perspective. What follows, and there, is the precise sequence of Abimelech's perception as he looks out through the window. First Isaac, then the act of sexual play or fondling, then the identity of the female partner in the dalliance, and at the very end, the conclusion that Rebekah must be Isaac's wife. All this is perfectly fluent as English, and modern translations like the Revised English Bible, the New Jewish Publication Society, and Spicer that place wife before Rebekah spoil a nice narrative effect in the original. But biblical syntax is also more flexible than modern English syntax, and there are hundreds of instances in the Hebrew Bible of significant syntactical inversions, and especially emphatic first positioning of weighted terms. Syntactical inversion, however, is familiar enough in the more traditional strata of literary English, and if one adopts a general norm of decorous stylization for the prose of the translation, as I have done on the grounds I explained earlier, it becomes feasible to reproduce most of the Hebrew reconfigurations of syntax, preserving the thematic or psychological emphases they are meant to convey. The present translation does this, I think, to a greater degree than all previous English versions. God repeatedly promises the patriarchs, to your seed I will give this land. Example, Genesis 12:7, pointedly putting your seed at the beginning of the statement, Less rhetorically, more dramatically, when Hagar is asked by the divine messenger in the wilderness where she's going, she responds, "From Sarai, my mistress, I am fleeing." Genesis 16:8, placing Sarai, the implacable source of her misery, at the beginning of the sentence. Still more strikingly, when Jacob is told by his sons that Simeon has been detained as a hostage in Egypt, and that the Egyptian regent insists Benjamin be brought down to him, the old man begins his lament by saying, "Me you have bereaved." Genesis 42:36. It is profoundly revelatory of Jacob's psychological posture that he should place himself as the object of suffering at the very beginning of his utterance, and again at the end in a little formal symmetry. Normally, biblical Hebrew indicates a pronominal object of a verb by attaching a suffix to the verb itself. Here, however, instead of the usual accusative suffix, we get an accusative first-person pronoun, oti, placed before the verb, a procedure that beautifully expresses Jacob's self-dramatization as anguished and resentful father, continually at the mercy of his sons. The me urgently needs to be thrust into the ear of the listener. Many translations simply suppress the inversion, but to put it decorously as "it is I," Everett Fox, or paraphrastically as "it is always me," New Jewish Publication Society, is to dilute the dramatic force of the original. The sharpness and vividness of biblical style are also diluted when it is represented in English, as virtually all the versions do, by a single indifferent level of diction. As I noted earlier, there seems to be nothing genuinely colloquial in the prose used by the narrator, but there is a palpable variation between passages that are more cadenced, more inclined to balance structures of terms in elevated language, like the narrative of the flood, and looser, more stylistically flexible passages. There are many instances, moreover, of single word choices that pointedly break with the stylistic decorum of the surrounding narrative. And for the most part, these are fudged by the sundry English translations. When Hagar and Ishmael use up their supply of water in the wilderness, this despairing mother flung the child under one of the bushes. Genesis 21:15. The verb here, hishlik, always means to throw, usually abruptly or violently. This is somewhat softened by the King James Version and Fox views cast. The Revised English Bible is uncomfortable with the idea of throwing a child and so translates thrust. Spicer and the New Jewish Publication Society Bible altogether disapprove of spasmodic maternal gestures and hence dissolve flung into a gentler left. In all such manipulation, the violence of Hagar's action and feelings disappears. When Laban berates Jacob for running off with his daughters, he says, "What have you done, driving my daughters like captives of the sword?" Genesis 31:26. All the English versions represent the verb here as carrying away, or some approximation thereof, but nahag is a term for driving animals, and is used precisely in that sense earlier in this very chapter, verse 18. To translate it otherwise is to lose the edge of brutal exaggeration in Laban's angry words. In the throes of the great famine, the destitute Egyptians say to Joseph, "Nothing is left for our Lord but our carcasses and our farmland." Genesis 47:18. Most English versions use bodies instead of carcasses, with a couple of modern translations flattening the language even more by rendering the term as persons. But the Hebrew, Gevia, with the sole exception of one famous mythopoeic text in Ezekiel, invariably means corpses or carcass. Corpse or carcass. What the miserable Egyptians are saying to their great overlord is that they've been reduced to little more than walking corpses, and he might as well have those. This sort of pungency can be conveyed if the translator recognizes that the Hebrew does not operate at a single bland level, and that literary expression is not inevitably bound to decorous logic. These last two examples were taken from dialogue, and it is chiefly in dialogue that we get small but vivid intimations of the colloquial. Again, these are eliminated in that flat regularity of conventional Bible translation. When God rebukes Abimelech for taking Sarah into his harem, the king vehemently protests that he has acted in good conscience. Did not he say to me, "She is my sister"? And she too said, "He is my brother." Genesis 25. The repetition of she too, is a stammer or splutter of indignation, clearly indicated in the Hebrew. In some English versions, it disappears altogether. The King James Version turns it into a rhetorical flourish, she, even she herself. Everett Fox, because of his commitment to literalism, comes closer, but without quite the requisite feeling of colloquial mimesis. And also she said. The 17-year-old Joseph reports the first of his dreams to his brothers in the following manner. And look, we were binding sheaves in the field, and look, my sheaf arose, and actually, Vegam, stood up, and look, your sheaves drew round and bowed to my sheaf. Genesis 37:7. The language here is surely crafted mimetically to capture the gigosh wonderment of this naive adolescent, who blithely assumes his brothers will share his sense of amazement at his dream. The presentative hinech, look, is the conventional term dreamers use to report the visual images of their dreams, perhaps partly because it readily introduces a surprising new perception. But here, Joseph repeats the term 3 times in one breathless sentence, and the effect of naive astonishment is equally expressed in his redundant arose and actually stood up. The Hebrew adverb gam most often means also, but fairly frequently serves as well as a term of emphasis or intensification. The point is that the adolescent Joseph speaking to his brothers does not at all sound like the adult Joseph addressing Pharaoh, and a translation should not reduce either dialogue or narrator's language to a single dead level. In the range of diction of the biblical text, the complementary opposite to these moments of colloquial mimesis occurs in the poetic insets. Most of these in the Torah are only a line or two of verse, though Genesis and Deuteronomy conclude with relatively long poems, and Exodus incorporates the Song of the Sea, as Numbers does Balaam's oracles. Now it has long been recognized by scholarship that biblical poetry reflects a stratum of Hebrew older than biblical prose. Some of the grammatical forms are different, and there is a distinctive poetic vocabulary, a good deal of it archaic. No previous English translation has made a serious effort to represent the elevated and archaic nature of the poetic language in contradistinction to the prose, though that is clearly part of the intended literary effect of biblical narrative. The present translation tries to suggest this contrast in levels of style through a more liberal use of syntactic inversion in the poetry, through a selective invocation of slightly archaic terms, and through the occasional deployment of rhetorical gestures broadly associated with older English poetry, like the ejaculation of "oh." I wish I could have gone further in this direction, but there is a manifest danger in sounding merely quaint instead of eloquently archaic. And so the stylistic baggage of anent and forsooth had to be firmly excluded. 2 minute examples will illustrate how these discriminations of stylistic level are made in Hebrew and how they might be conveyed in English. The enigmatic notice about the Nephilim, the human divine hybrids of the primeval age, concludes with these words, "They are the heroes of yore, the men of renown." Genesis 6:4. This line could conceivably be a fragment from an old mythological poem. More probably, it reads in the original as a kind of stylistic citation of the epic genre. The clearest clue to this in the Hebrew is the word they, which here is hema rather than the standard hem. This variant with the extra syllable is, in all likelihood, an older form. It occurs 4 times more often in poetry than in prose, and even in prose is often reserved for rather ceremonial gestures. There is no English variant of they that is similarly marked as poetic diction, and my translation compensates by using of yore instead of the phrase of old, adopted by the King James Version, and by most later English versions. In the next chapter, the unleashing of the deluge is reported in this line of verse, with emphatic semantic parallelism, and 4 Hebrew accents against 3 in the 2 halves of the line, all the well springs the great deep burst, and the casements of the heavens opened. 7:11. In order to convey a sense that this is poetry beyond the mechanics of typography, a translator, of course, has to create a good deal of rhythmic regularity. But there remains a problem of diction. The Hebrew word represented by casements is arubot. It is a rare term, occurring only a few times elsewhere in the Bible, and it clearly means window or window-like niche. The decision of several different modern translators to render it as sluices or floodgates has no philological warrant, and is a conspicuous instance of translation by context. Windows, in the King James Version, is on target semantically but not stylistically. The occurrence of a cognate of Arabot in Ugaritic poetry, several centuries before the composition of Genesis, is further indication that the term is poetic and probably somewhat archaic for the later Hebrew audience. Casements, with its echoes of Keats and of Shakespeare behind Keats, seemed like a happy solution to the problem of diction, though not all shifts in stylistic level in the Hebrew can be so readily represented by English equivalents. A translation that tries to do justice to the richness of the Hebrew must aim for some approximation of the nuances of diction in the original. The most pervasive aspect of the magic of biblical style that has been neglected by English translators is its beautiful rhythms. An important reason for the magnetic appeal of these stories when you read them in the Hebrew is the rhythmic power of the words that convey the story. The British critic A. Alvarez has aptly described the crucial role of rhythm in all literary art. The rhythm, the way the sounds move, combine, separate, recombine, is the vehicle for the feeling. And without that inner movement or disturbance, the words, no matter how fetching, remain inert. In this way, at least, the dynamics of poetry, and probably of all the arts, are the same as the dynamics of dreaming. I know of no modern English translation of the Bible that is not blotted by constant patches of arrhythmia, and the result is precisely the sense of inertness of which Alvarez speaks. The King James Version, of course, has its grand rhythmic movements. Cultivated people around 1611 clearly had a much firmer sense of expressive sound and language than has been true of recent generations. But these rhythms are more orotund, less powerfully compact than those of the Hebrew, and in fact are far more local lapses in rhythm than nostalgic readers of the King James may recall. The final arbiter of rhythmic effectiveness must be the inner ear of the sensitive reader, but I would like to show that there is a vital dimension of biblical prose that translation has to engage by quoting a couple of verses in transliteration, and then in 3 English versions, together with my own. In regard to the transliteration, it should be kept in mind that we have an approximate notion, not an exact one, of how Biblical Hebrew was originally pronounced. There is some question about vowels in particular because vowel points were added to the consonant texts by the Masoretes, the Hebrew scholars of 6th to 10th century Tiberius, who fixed the text of the Bible with full punctuation standard since then, more than a millennium after the texts were composed. There was, however, a continuous tradition for recitation of the texts on which the Masoretes drew, and anyone who has listened to the Masoretic text read out loud can attest to its strong rhythmic integrity, which argues that its system of pronunciation was by no means an arbitrary imposition. Here is the narrative report of Noah's entering the ark as the deluge is unleashed. Genesis 7:13 and 14. Acute accents are used to indicate accented syllables. W is used for the letter Vav, pronounced as V in modern Hebrew, but as a W in biblical times, especially to distinguish it from Vet, without Dagesh, pronounced as Ve or V. H indicates a light fricative, sounding something like the Spanish ch. KH represents a heavier fricative, like the German ch as in Bach. Betsem Hayom Hazeh Ba Noah Weshem Weham vayechet bene Noah weshet Noah ushloshet neshevana itam el hateva hema vekol haya lamina vekol habehema lamina vekol haremes haromes al ha'atz lamenechu vekol ha'of lamenechu kol tzipor kol kana. The Hebrew rhythm unfolds in groupings of 3 or 4 words marked by 3 or 4 stresses, usually with no more than 1 or 2 unstressed syllables between the stressed ones, and the sense of the words invites a slight pause between one grouping and the next. The overall effect is that of a grand, solemn sweep, a sort of epic march, and that effect is reinforced in the diction by the use of chema instead of hem for they at the beginning of the second verse. Here is the King James Version. In the selfsame day entered Noah, and Shem, and Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them, into the ark. They, and every beast after its kind, and all the cattle after their kind, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth after his kind, and every fowl after his kind, every bird of every sort. The first of the 2 verses up to into the ark is nearly perfect. I envy the freedom of the King James Version to follow the Hebrew syntax and write, entered Noah, an inversion feasible at the beginning of the 17th century, but a little too odd, I'm afraid, at the beginning of the 21st. But in the second verse, rhythmic difficulties emerge. The repeated after its kind, with its sequencing of a trochee and an im and its 2 stresses, is an ungainly equivalent of the Hebrew lamina. Every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth is a whole mouthful of syllables in exchange for the compactness of the Hebrew. And every bird of every sort falls flat as a final cadence, apart from being inaccurate as a translation. Here is E.A. Spicer's version of these 2 verses, a version, to be sure, intended to be accompanied by a philological commentary, but one that helped set a norm for recent Bible translations. On the aforesaid day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons had entered the ark, they as well as every kind of beast, every kind of creature that creeps on earth, and every kind of bird, every winged thing. The initial phrase, on the aforesaid day, is an ill-starred beginning in regard to diction as well as to rhythm. Something as mechanical as the list of the passengers of the ark is divided up in a way that undercuts its rhythmic momentum. At best, one could say that this version has intermittent moments of escape into rhythm. Everett Fox, the most boldly literal of modern Bible translators, does a little better, but his attention to rhythm is by no means unflagging. On that very day came Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, Noah's wife, and his 3 sons' wives with them into the ark. They and all wildlife after their kind, all herd animals after their kind, all crawling things that crawl upon the earth after their kind, all fowl after their kind, all chirping things, all winged things. The first short pause with the courageous inversion of verb and subject rings nicely in the ear, but the simple deletion of the and between Shem and Ham collapses the rhythm, and Fox's grouping of the list is not much better rhythmically than Spicer's. As in the King James Version, the decision to use after 4 times introduces a kind of unwelcome extra syllables, and rhythm is virtually lost in all herd animals after their kind, all crawling things that crawl upon the earth after their kind. Here's my own version, far from perfect, but meant to preserve more of the phonetic compactness of the Hebrew and to avoid such glaring lapses into arrhythmia. That very day, Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons together with them, came into the ark, they as well as beasts of each kind, and cattle of each kind, and each kind of crawling thing that crawls on the earth, and each kind of bird, each winged thing. Biblical Hebrew, in sum, has a distinctive music, a lovely precision of lexical choice, a meaningful concreteness, and a suppleness of expressive syntax that, by and large, have been given short shrift by translators with their eyes on other goals. Present translation, whatever its imperfections, seeks to do fuller justice to all these aspects of biblical style in the hope of making the rich literary experience of the Hebrew more accessible to readers of English.